The series begins with Hyun at university, where he sees two of his friends meeting and getting phone numbers from two girls. Later, his friends show him pictures of a villa they've rented with a swimming pool and tell him they're planning a party, inviting him to join and split the rental cost among the three of them. However, Hyun declines and goes home. Later, one of his friends calls him again, saying they're waiting for him and suggesting he takes a taxi to get there quick. Hyun explains he has no money, so his friend advises him to ask his parents for money, pretending he needs it for university books, as they would definitely give it to him. While on the phone, Hyun notices his father's taxi parked outside and decides to take it without anyone noticing. He sneaks out and drives quickly to avoid getting stopped since he's driving a taxi. Suddenly, he stops at a traffic light and a girl gets into the taxi. When he tries to stop her, she threatens to report him for refusing a passenger, forcing him to drive her to her destination. Her name is Kim. Hyun's friends call him, saying the party has started, but he tells them he can't make it right now. Meanwhile, Kim asks him to take her to the river, where she goes for a walk and makes him get her ice cream. Afterward, he drives her home and accidentally bumps into a neighbor's car. Hyun gets out to apologize, but the man says it's not a big deal. Kim then invites Hyun inside to hang out, and she shares about her life, revealing that she lives alone after her mother's death and that a friend who used to live with her left after they had a fight. She convinces Hyun to try different drugs with her, and they stay up all night playing a knife game that ends with Kim cutting her hand. Hyun is very worried, but she remains calm, telling him it's nothing, continuing to play. They eventually fall asleep. Hyun wakes up the next morning looking for Kim. He finds her in her room, but there's blood on the bed. Shocked, he uncovers her and discovers she's been murdered, with blood everywhere. Terrified, he runs out of the house, but remembers he left the car keys inside, goes back, breaks the door to retrieve the keys, and also takes the knife they played with, hiding it in his pocket before leaving quickly. As he drives away, he's very anxious and suddenly encounters a police checkpoint. A detective stops him, suspecting he's under the influence of alcohol, and prepares to use a breathalyzer, but it runs out of battery. At that moment, she receives a report of a break-in nearby. She takes Hyun with her in the police car to the reported house, where he's horrified to realize it's Kim's house. His fear intensifies when they discover her body, and witnesses claim they saw someone leave the house in a hurry and get into a taxi. Hyun desperately tries to avoid being identified by the witnesses. They take Hyun to the police station, along with the officers who are investigating the crime scene and questioning the neighbors. All the neighbors' statements are consistent, saying that the last person they saw at the victim's house was a young man in his early 20s with a taxi. Meanwhile, Hyun is sitting in the police station, and his father keeps calling him because he's late and has the car. Hyun decides not to answer. When the officer and the detective return to the station, they search Hyun and find a knife in his pocket with his fingerprints on it. They also confirm he was driving under the influence, which increases their suspicions since all the suspect descriptions match him, and he was arrested near the crime scene. At this point, Hyun breaks down, insisting they're wrong and that he didn't kill her. He cries, feeling unjustly accused, so they restrain him on the floor to calm him down. Later, the officer takes Hyun for questioning, where he tells the officer everything that happened that day, explaining he ran away and didn't report her death because he was scared. The officer tells him it's hard for anyone to believe his story, especially since he was the last person with her and many neighbors saw him. Meanwhile, Hyun's family keeps calling him, worried because he hasn't returned since yesterday, and they consider reporting him missing to the police. At the station, they make Hyun change all his clothes and notice he has scratches on his body and hands, treating him as the murderer and placing him in a cell. A lawyer named Shin visits his client, whom he successfully defended in another case, and learns about Hyun's case. He decides to talk to Hyun and offer to represent him, advising Hyun not to talk to anyone or tell anyone anything further and to deny any charges against him. After leaving, Shin inquires about the officer handling the case and learns it's Officer Park, one of the best officers who is set to retire in 3 months, which worries Shin because he knows Park will focus intensely on this last case. Officer Park then calls in the victim's neighbor, whose car Hyun hit, and the neighbor identifies Hyun as the person he saw with Kim on the day of the incident. At the same time, the forensic lab is conducting its investigation to produce the autopsy report. Officer Park summons the victim's stepfather for questioning, who says he left the house long ago, after the victim's mother died, and hasn't seen the victim since then. He signs a consent form for the autopsy. The next day, Hyun's family arrives at the police station, and Officer Park allows them to see Hyun. Hyun, overwhelmed, tells them everything that happened, and they believe he didn't do anything wrong. During this time, Officer Park watches and listens to them through the cameras in the room. When lawyer Shin arrives and sees what's happening, he gets very upset and speaks with Hyun, reminding him that he warned him not to talk to anyone about what happened. He tells Hyun that everything said was recorded and could be used against him, and gets angry because Hyun didn't listen to him. Hyun explains that he had to reassure his worried mother that he didn't do anything. After lawyer Shin leaves, Officer Park decides to visit Hyun's cell and talk to him, wanting Hyun to confess so they can close the case and the charges stick. He tries to pressure Hyun, saying his father's taxi is impounded and they need it released so his father can work and support the family. Hyun responds that he can't speak without his lawyer present. At that time, Officer Park learns from his team that Hyun's case has gone viral on social media and in the press, and everyone is talking about it. Seizing the opportunity, he gives Hyun a specific t-shirt to wear so that when the media photographs him, he appears to be a delinquent based on his attire. The next day, when Hyun is brought before the prosecutor and his lawyer sees him, the lawyer becomes very angry, understanding the game the officer is playing. Realizing that they forced Hyun to wear that outfit, he reassures Hyun and tells him he will stay by his side. Officer Park then goes to Hyun's house with a search warrant, thoroughly searching the entire house, especially Hyun's room, looking for anything that could serve as evidence against him. He returns to his office to organize the case, confident he will win, especially since all the evidence shows Hyun's fingerprints everywhere in the house, with no other prints present. Meanwhile, Shin visits Hyun before meeting with the public prosecutor, reassuring him. During the session, Shin defends Hyun, trying to convince them of his innocence, arguing that it doesn't make sense for someone to kill a person they just met. After the session, Shin confronts the journalist who wrote an article attacking Hyun, accusing him of mercilessly stabbing the innocent girl 13 times. He blames her for making unverified claims when the truth hasn't come out yet. It's clear that Shin is very confident in Hyun's innocence. As they leave, a large number of journalists are waiting to find out what happened, turning Hyun's case into a public issue. Hyun is then taken back to his cell, where he remains distraught, repeatedly insisting he didn't kill her. The next day, Hyun is transferred to the prison building and placed in the same ward as a man suffering from panic attacks, who makes terrifying noises throughout the night, leaving Hyun very scared. In the morning, during the lineup, Hyun notices that the prisoners have formed gangs and bully the weaker inmates. He sees them beating the sick boy in his ward, which deeply upsets him. Hyun goes to get painkillers from the prison clinic for the boy. When the gang members see Hyun giving him the medication, they decide to target Hyun even more, especially after learning he is accused of murder and rape. Meanwhile, lawyer Shin goes to Hyun's family, asking for the fee to defend their son, assuring them he will stay with him, try to help in every possible way, and reduce the sentence. At the same time, another lawyer, Seojin, decides to take on the case pro bono to gain fame and attention, especially given the media frenzy surrounding it. She chooses a trainee lawyer to assist her. We see Shin visit Officer Park, who is reviewing photos of Hyun as a teenager and child. Shin asks if Park truly believes Hyun killed Kim. Park asserts that he can recognize a criminal at a glance and believes Hyun is one of those seemingly nice, innocent-looking individuals who are actually brutal criminals. He supports his claim by pointing out that Hyun had multiple opportunities to report the murder and clear himself, such as when he first woke up to find her dead, when he broke back into the house for the keys, and when he was stopped at the checkpoint but didn't confess. Shin defends Hyun, saying he acted out of panic and fear, with his first instinct being to flee. Seojin sends the trainee lawyer to Hyun's house, asking his family to come to her office. There, she tells them that Shin is a fraud who will charge them a lot without benefiting them, and offers to represent Hyun for free. They agree, feeling relieved and grateful, especially since the trainee lawyer was a schoolmate of Hyun's. Hyun's father calls him, informing him about Seojin's offer and their acceptance due to financial constraints. The next day, Shin visits Hyun, bringing many items he might need. They discuss the next steps, but Hyun tells him about Seojin's offer, apologizing and returning the items. Shin refuses to take them back, saying he brought them for Hyun, and acknowledging that Seojin is a reputable lawyer, possibly better for his case. Internally, Shin feels very upset and visits Seojin's office, but he is not allowed to meet her. Angrily, he accuses them of stealing his case and vows not to give up easily. That night, Hyun is terrified and anxious, thinking about what might happen to him. He wakes up shocked to find his cellmate, the one suffering from panic attacks and constantly beaten by prison gangs, has hanged himself. Hyun screams and calls the guards, but it's too late. The sight leaves Hyun in a state of shock and fear, leading him to run as if trying to escape. Guards and officers chase him, knock him down, and beat him, place Hyun in solitary confinement. Meanwhile, the prosecutor and Officer Park agree to put Hyun through a lie detector test, believing it will help quickly resolve the case. The next day, they bring Hyun in, trying to convince him that taking the test will prove his innocence if he truly is. Park adds that life in prison will be unbearable for him, as inmates despise murderers and rapists, and he will suffer greatly. Under pressure, Hyun agrees. They contact his lawyer, but Shin informs them they have the wrong person, as he has been replaced. They then notify Seojin, who gets angry that they moved Hyun without informing her, and sends the trainee lawyer to warn Hyun not to make any decisions without consulting insulting her, threatening to drop the case otherwise. Officer Park takes Hyun to the forensic building to show him Kim's body, trying to break him before the test. Seeing the body, Hyun collapses, struggling to breathe. Park takes his asthma medication, telling him he cannot have any drugs before the test. At the same time, Shin arrives at the building where his ex-wife works and convinces her to help him get in. He sees Park and Hyun, accusing Hyun of agreeing to their demands, but Hyun explains he only agreed to prove his innocence. Park prevents Shin from talking to Hyun further, citing his lack of official status as a lawyer. They proceed with the test, placing Hyun's asthma medication in front of him to increase his stress and urgency. The questions are designed to apply maximum pressure. The trainee lawyer objects and steps out to call Seojin, finding her phone off. Shin, watching from outside the room, suspects they are pressing Hyun hard and advises the trainee lawyer to intervene. She follows his advice, stopping the test by arguing that Hyun's asthma makes the test unsafe. They agree, and Hyun leaves, barely able to breathe, thanking Shin for his help. Meanwhile, Shin investigates the victim, Kim, and discovers she had been seeing a psychiatrist and taking narcotic medications for 3 years. He goes to the clinic and obtains documents that prove his findings. The next day, at Hyun's second hearing, Seojin, his lawyer, notices injuries on his hands and body, using this to his advantage in court. She argues that Hyun, a university student, shouldn't be placed among dangerous criminals who assault him. She tries to prove his innocence. However, the prosecutor counters, convincing the court that Hyun is guilty, especially since he refused the lie detector test. The court decides to continue the case until Hyun confesses or strong evidence against him is found. Hyun leaves the hearing devastated, crying, especially seeing his mother equally distraught. Shin takes the documents proving the victim's mental illness and drug use and sells them to Seojin. She presents them to the prosecutor, showing that the drugs Hyun consumed that day were given to him by the victim, proving he isn't a drug addict like her. Seojin proposes cooperation, agreeing to a 10-year sentence for Hyun. The prosecutor agrees to this deal, asking Seojin to persuade Hyun to confess to accidental murder. Seojin convinces Hyun to confess, promising the sentence will be just 10 years instead of life imprisonment or the death penalty, and he might be released in 6 years with good behavior. Initially, Hyun refuses to confess to something he didn't do, but she eventually persuades him. When Shin finds out, he talks to Hyun, telling him he would never confess to a crime he didn't commit. At the third hearing, when asked if he killed Kim, Hyun surprises Seojin by reneging on their agreement and denying the murder. Seojin gets angry and decides to drop the case, leaving it to the trainee lawyer, believing it to be a lost cause. The trainee lawyer approaches Shin, proposing they work together on the case. Shin visits Hyun in prison, informing him that he will be his lawyer again. He feels deeply troubled upon seeing Hyun's injuries from prison gangs and acknowledges the difficulty of his situation. Shin starts working on the case again, using his ex-wife, a forensic expert, to examine the victim's house thoroughly. She finds overlooked details, like a broken balcony door handle, suggesting someone else might have entered the victim's room from the balcony. She promises to work diligently on the evidence to find a strong lead. The next day, Hyun is taken to court for a hearing with a jury and a forensic expert. They present a picture of the injury on his hand from the day of the incident, claiming it happened during the murder. His lawyer shows photos of his life before the incident, portraying him as an ordinary young man with no motive to kill someone he barely knew. The prosecutor interrupts, stating that Hyun is pretending not to remember anything from that day and denying the murder. She requests the court to take him to the crime scene, hoping it will jog his memory and prompt a confession, and the majority agrees. They all go to the crime scene. Before entering, Shin advises Hyun to stay calm despite any provocations. They begin reenacting the crime, alleging that Hyun attempted to assault the victim and killed her when she resisted. Hyun can't bear to watch or listen, collapsing as they enter the victim's room, with reporters capturing the moment. Shin gets angry, fearing for Hyun's well-being as no one helps him regain consciousness. Hyun is taken to the hospital, where Officer Park visits him, accusing him of faking to buy time and evade confession. He warns Hyun that he will continue to pursue him until he uncovers the truth. Afterward, they return to court, where the officers present at the checkpoint on the day of the incident testify, explaining why they suspected Hyun and arrested him. The trainee lawyer, representing Hyun for the first time, defends him by questioning the arresting officer's actions, who apprehended Hyun without a warrant or solid evidence and put him in the police car based on mere suspicion without even conducting a drug test. She begins to sway the jury, who starts to empathize with Hyun, noting that there is still no direct evidence against him. However, the prosecutor brings in Hyun's high school teacher to testify against him. The teacher recounts an incident years ago when Hyun pushed a classmate down the stairs after a fight. Hyun defends himself, explaining that the boy had bullied him and mocked his father, a humble taxi driver. driver. He admits that he later apologized to the boy. After the session, Shin shows Hyun a photo of a fruit plate in the victim's bedroom, noting that the knife found with Hyun was the same one from the fruit plate. Hyun clarifies that the knife he had was from the kitchen and he knew nothing about the knife upstairs. Shin then shows Hyun a photo of Kim with her friend, recalling that Kim mentioned living with her until they had a big fallout. Shin decides to find this friend and meets her, pressing her until she reveals that they fought 2 weeks before Kim's death because Kim had an affair with her boyfriend who supplied them with drugs. Shin then confronts the boyfriend, who denies everything. Shin leaves his phone recording in the shop and retrieves it later, revealing incriminating evidence. However, they realize the court won't accept this recording since it was made without consent. The lawyer decides to call the friend and the boyfriend as witnesses in court. Shin reviews the surveillance footage from the day of the incident, noticing a delivery man following Hyun and Kim to the river. He visits the delivery company and learns that the delivery man was fired due to a criminal record and was familiar with Kim as he regularly delivered to her. Shin decides to investigate the witnesses further while the trainee lawyer takes charge in court. During the hearing, Officer Park uses street surveillance footage showing Hyun driving his taxi, claiming he didn't pick up any passengers until he chose his victim, a lone girl. He accuses Hyun of deliberately planning the murder since he didn't report the incident to the police or anyone else. Hyun, frustrated, insists he didn't kill her, leading the prosecutor to pressure him into testifying. Despite his lawyer's warnings, Hyun agrees. The prosecutor aggressively questions Hyun, accusing him of selfishness for not helping the bleeding victim even if he was innocent, which could have saved her life. Under intense pressure, Hyun breaks down and admits he's unsure if he killed her or not. Meanwhile, Shin confronts the delivery man, accusing him of killing Kim since the surveillance footage showed him following her. The delivery man attempts to attack Shin, but Shin escapes, and the police arrive in time to arrest the delivery man. The lawyer calls Shin, telling him she mishandled the situation and should have stopped Hyun from testifying. Shin reassures the despondent Hyun after the hearing. Hyun's statement spreads in the media, interpreted as an admission of guilt, implying he might have killed her while under the influence of drugs. Back in prison, Hyun faces harsh treatment and beatings from gangs again. A fellow inmate who had protected Hyun before talks to him. He reveals he was imprisoned for assault and, feeling unjustly accused and disbelieved, attempted suicide. However, he later decided to become strong to avoid being overpowered by the gangs. He offers to teach Hyun to defend himself. The next day, the court session begins with the new witnesses. The first is the victim's friend, who fought with her and moved out. The boyfriend, who supplied drugs, testifies that Kim threatened him when she discovered he reconciled with her friend. He adds that Kim sounded drunk and incoherent during the call. The friend claims she left her boyfriend to mend her relationship with Kim, but Kim ignored her attempts to reconcile. After the session, Shin feels that they aren't lying and grows more puzzled about the case. Afterward, Hyun returns to prison and continues his martial arts training. When the prison gangs try to attack him again, he manages to fight them off and defeat them. The next day, he returns to court, but this time the delivery man is the witness. Shin presents surveillance footage showing the delivery man following Hyun and the victim from the gas station. He accuses the delivery man of deliberately disabling his ankle monitor to commit the crime without being tracked, arguing that he had a motive due to his previous criminal record and a complaint filed by the victim which led to his dismissal from the company, suggesting he sought revenge. However, the court remains unconvinced due to a lack of concrete evidence. During the same session, Hyun's ex-wife presents forensic evidence proving that Hyun's hand injury was caused by breaking the door to retrieve his car keys, noting the broken balcony door handle and the missing knife as the likely murder weapon. She also highlights that the knife found with Hyun was completely different from the one used to kill the victim. Furthermore, the forensic report is biased towards the prosecutor's narrative, as it shows the killer used their right hand for the stabbings, while Hyun has a disability in his right hand and doesn't use it for anything. The prosecutor objects, accusing her of bias due to her relationship with Hyun and their daughter's lawyer, Shin. The session ends without a resolution. A new session is scheduled, and the court calls the victim's stepfather, who, upon hearing the news, immediately thought about inheriting and selling the house. Shin accuses him of greed and questions his whereabouts on the day of the incident. The prosecutor presents surveillance footage showing him walking with his girlfriend. Shin feels like all his efforts are in vain, as none of the witnesses raise substantial suspicions or evidence. The final witness is Kim's neighbor, whose car Hyun had hit. Surveillance footage shows him frequently watching her house and approaching it daily. He claims he did so because he was infatuated with her friend. Shin feels frustrated and returns to review all the photos again. Exhausted, he falls asleep, and the lawyer with him notices a photo of Hyun's asthma inhaler, which wasn't included in the evidence as it was left at the victim's house. Shin decides to question Officer Park in court, suspecting he deliberately excluded the inhaler to avoid showing Hyun as weak or sick, preventing any sympathy towards him. Officer Park responds that he didn't think the inhaler was relevant to the evidence. Seeing the jury starting to sympathize, the prosecutor reiterates that all evidence points to Hyun and demands the death penalty. The following day, during the final judgment, the court sentences Hyun to life imprisonment. His parents break down, and both Hyun and Shin feel devastated and unjustly treated. Back in prison, Hyun's family visits him, assuring him that there is still an appeal. This is not the final verdict. However, Hyun remains indifferent, trying to adapt to life in prison with the help of his friend, who has always protected and assisted him. But tragedy strikes when a gang member stabs his friend in the neck, sending him to the hospital, leaving Hyun alone. The prosecutor gets promoted, and Officer Park celebrates his retirement after completing his service. Despite this, Shin continues to work on the case, confident in Hyun's innocence. He revisits the victim's neighbor, who had been monitoring her because he liked her friend. Shin notices a camera in his car, and the neighbor claims he handed all the photos to the court, revealing that the victim frequently brought someone home. Shin is puzzled as no one mentioned these photos and manages to obtain them. He also retrieves her phone records, discovering that her therapist called her that day. Surveillance footage shows the therapist frequently visiting her house, raising Shin's suspicion further. He decides to monitor him. Shin then approaches Officer Park, sharing his findings about the therapist, suspecting him as the real killer due to his relationship with the victim and a confrontation when she discovered he was married. Park initially dismisses him, stating the case is closed and he's retired. Seeing Park playing with his grandson, Shin appeals to his sense of justice, reminding him that Hyun has a family who loves him too. Moved, Park agrees to speak to the prosecutor about reopening the case. Meanwhile, Shin visits Hyun in prison, assuring him they have found the real killer and that he will be released soon. Hyun feels relieved and thanks Shin for everything. At this moment, the prosecutor announces they have arrested the real killer, who confessed during the investigation. Hyun is subsequently released from prison, welcomed by his family, and returns home. He tries to reintegrate into normal life after all he has been through.